you want to introduce me or should I just start?
Well, this is Dan Brodkin from UC. And yeah, he'll be giving his talk on Philippine voice and split absolutive syntax.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tamisha. So yes, I'm Dan, and I'm here to talk about Philippine-type voice and specifically where absolutive licensing comes from in a set of languages in Sulawesi. So we know that the Philippine-type languages of the Philippines, Taiwan, and so on and so forth show what we call voice systems. Crucially for us, we're interested in a two-way contrast between an agent voice, where an external argument triggers absolutive agreement or bears absolutive case, and a patient voice, where the internal argument does all of that. Throughout this talk, I'll be abbreviating external and internal argument as ext and int. Now, in many of these languages, voice also interacts not just with case, but with A-bar extraction and the definiteness of the internal argument. So I've schematized that here in Mandar, Mandar, a language of the South Sulawesi subfamily, where the agent voice involves a prefix mang on the verb, and an absolutive enclitic, which indexes the external argument, and the patient voice, which involves no patient voice morpheme, but an ergative prefix on the verb and an absolutive enclitic that indexes the internal argument. So you can think of the agreement system here as doing what case marking does in Tagalog. So we know that in these languages, the absolutive argument shows hierarchical privilege. It binds into other arguments. It appears to occupy a high position. And so there's sort of near consensus that it moves somewhere, the absolutive argument. But beyond this, there's very little agreement over what the actual position of the absolutive argument is and what underlies its movement to this position in languages of this type. So in today's talk, I will be arguing for a sort of high licensing analysis of Philippine-type voice systems in a set of languages in Sulawesi. This is similar to the analysis in Guilfoyle et al. In '92 and is identical to what was discussed by me and my colleague Justin Royer earlier this week. On this model, the absolutive argument moves to spec TP as a result of licensing by T. That's the central insight of this model. It allows the relevant set of languages to be understood as showing high absolutive syntax in the broader, more general sense. Now, this model commits us to a specific prediction about nominal licensing in this set of languages. So if the absolutive argument cannot be licensed beneath T, then removing T should create a problem. And we should see when we remove T, special strategies of licensing appear, if T really does play a crucial role in licensing the absolutive. Now, my goal today is to show that this prediction is correct for many languages on the island of Sulawesi, for those of three specific subgroups. So in these languages, the internal argument, when definite, typically is absolutive. It interacts with T. When we remove T and make it so that the internal argument cannot interact with this head, we see these languages implicate a special strategy of low absolutive licensing. So in other words, removing T causes something special to happen in the little VP. And the presence of this construction, or this behavior, I think, reveals requirements for licensing that are typically not met beneath T. Okay, so let me contextualize this a little bit. So much work agrees that the absolutive argument sits in a high position in Philippine-type languages, and the literature has sort of typically approached this in one of two ways. There's one approach, which I'll refer to as a sort of high licensing analysis, where the absolutive argument undergoes a movement to something like spec TP, a real subject position. And this movement occurs as the byproduct of a licensing relationship with T. Another very prominent line of work argues that there's really no such thing as a special absolutive position and no special relationship between the absolutive argument and T. On this model, the pivot or absolutive is just the highest thing in the little VP. And in patient voice, the internal argument reaches this position by undergoing object shift. So there's a process of object shift that applies within the little VP on that model. Now, today's talk argues for a version of the high licensing analysis in several languages of Sulawesi, as I mentioned. On this model, two things need to occur. So the absolutive argument will be systematically licensed by T and will move to spec of TP. And this is separate from a step of movement which applies to definite internal arguments. So I argue that definite internal arguments do undergo object shift. This is related to the voice alternation in some languages, but it does not place the internal argument above the external argument. So this is my claim. This is what I have claimed in the past for Mandar in a patient voice clause. The internal argument winds up in spec TP. It reaches this position by undergoing 2 steps of movement. In the little VP, it shifts. It remains beneath the external argument in this domain, and then it interacts with T. We see agreement, and then the internal argument moves to this high position. So this is the model that I'll be arguing for when where the absolutive argument moves to high position because of T. Now, there's many reasons to adopt a view like this independent of what I'm talking about today. But the central evidence lies in the behavior of definite but non-absolutive internal arguments, right? So internal arguments that undergo this step of movement are definite and shift, but don't wind up interacting with T and moving all the way up here. So let me explain why. In matrix monotransitive contexts, so simple transitive clauses, many Philippine-type languages, and crucially these Philippine-type languages of Sulawesi, show a definiteness effect. So when the internal argument is definite, we need to use the patient voice. This is a patient voice clause. I love you. In Mandar, we have the internal argument being absolutive. 4b shows an agent voice clause, which is completely ungrammatical. So you cannot say agent voice, I love you in this language. So a definite internal argument has to surface, has to wind up in spec T. I take this pattern to reflect primarily a property of the agent voice, of the little v that appears in agent voice. So it doesn't allow the relevant step of shift, which is obligatory for definite internal arguments. And so the agent voice construction is just excluded when the internal argument is definite. So once we have a definite internal argument, we're committed to patient voice. And this has consequences for patterns of nominal licensing. So in the patient voice, naturally, the external argument is not absolutive. It doesn't interact with T. So it needs to be licensed lower than T. And the internal argument does need to interact with T to be licensed. In agent voice, for a comparison, right, the external argument does interact with T and the internal argument is indefinite, small. I assume it doesn't need to be case licensed. So we've arrived at a system where definite internal arguments in the patient voice need to interact with T. On this model, we kind of run into a problem. So there are contexts where the internal argument cannot interact with T. I'll call these agent voice only contexts. So for instance, Philippine-type languages typically require the agent voice when the external argument undergoes A-bar extraction. We can see this in 7a. This is just an agent voice clause. Who reads books? We've extracted who, and we have agent voice morphology in the lower clause. This is obligatory. Nevertheless, despite the presence of agent voice morphology, it's possible for the internal argument to be definite here. This is also true in Tagalog, famously. So what happens? Well, this construction in the past has posed challenges to models which assume literal object shift, placing the internal argument above the external argument in the patient voice, right? If we assume that all definite things move above the external argument, we have to deny object shift in this context. It's clear in Mandar, as I argued last year, that there is in fact object shift when an internal argument is definite in one of these contexts. So something like who loves me, the internal argument can undergo object shift. But the real question involves licensing. So how, in this context where T cannot interact with the internal argument, can a definite internal argument be licensed? What is happening? So let's just restate the problem. In these contexts, we predict a problem of licensing. Definite internal arguments have licensing needs, which are not met beneath T, but in agent voice only contexts, they cannot interact with T. So given a restrictive theory of nominal licensing, we wind up with a prediction. In agent voice only contexts, these languages need to allow the internal argument to be licensed beneath T. We need something special happening beneath T. Now, in a comparative perspective, we know that something funny does happen in these contexts. So many further north of Sulawesi, the languages of the Philippines and Taiwan often do treat definite internal arguments differently in contexts where the agent voice is required. For instance, we see special case marking in a lot of these languages. So as Micho observes, in this variety of Arayal, if you extract an external argument and you have a definite internal argument, so something like who ate that taro, we get absolutive marking on the internal argument, not normally available in agent voice. So this pattern should give us an initial clue that something funny is happening around the little VP in these contexts. But we can make a specific prediction, a really specific prediction on the licensing model about agreement. So setting case marking aside, we know that patterns of agreement do correlate with licensing in a way that case might not. And when we see agreement, can identify exactly where it comes from. So the behavior of agreement can reveal what the structural source of licensing is in a given context. So if we adopt this sort of high licensing analysis, we predict the existence of languages where licensing correlates with agreement. The absolutive argument systematically triggers agreement on T. That's how we know that that's how it's licensed. And when the internal argument is definite in a forced agent voice context where we see where it can't interact with T, we should see it triggering agreement lower in the clause. Right, so this should be our prediction. I've schematized this in 9. We have an internal argument that can interact with T. It still needs to be licensed. So we predict that there should be languages where some little v that hosts agreement comes to the rescue and agrees with this argument and licenses it. What I'd like to point out in this talk is that this is exactly what we see across a set of Philippine-type languages in Sulawesi. So we see this in the languages of the South Sulawesi, Bungku Tolaki, and Kaili Pomona subgroups. Okay, so let's meet this set of languages. The South Sulawesi languages are a set of about 20 languages spoken in southern and western Sulawesi. They show a typical Philippine-type voice system. They show a definiteness effect, so definite internal arguments require the patient voice. And today we'll be focusing on Konjo, which is a verb initial language of the southern subgroup of South Sulawesi. So in this language, like Mondar, the pivot or absolutive argument triggers absolutive agreement. And in matrix monotransitive contexts, when the internal argument is definite, it must be absolutive. So I've just shown this here. Tane shows an agent voice clause. Amir eats bananas. We have an agent voice prefix ang, an absolutive enclitic indexing the external argument Amir, and the internal argument is indefinite. When the internal argument is definite, we get a patient voice clause. This shows all the normal properties of the patient voice. Ergative prefix, absolutive enclitic indexing the internal argument. Okay. Now, across this family, there's sort of been consensus in the theoretical literature that the absolutive agreement sits in T. Right? This will provide a piece of evidence for licensing of the absolutive by T. So this absolutive agreement marker surfaces in second position. It disappears in non-finite contexts. It forms portmanteaus with aspect, and it disappears when the pivot or absolutive argument is extracted. So all of these things are reasons to believe that the absolutive argument triggers agreement on T, and therefore is licensed by this head. And naturally, the argument which triggers this agreement moves to the specifier of TP. It alone binds into all other arguments in the clause, and it's the only argument which can undergo A-bar extraction. So we could model this with a sort of high licensing model laid out earlier in this talk, where agreement sits in T, licenses the absolutive argument, and attracts it to the specifier of TP. Now, what happens in agent voice only contexts? We know that under normal circumstances in this language, the internal argument, when it is definite, needs to be licensed by T. In other words, a definite internal argument requires the patient voice. However, the internal argument can be definite in the agent voice only contexts, where it cannot interact with T. Now, in this context, which I'll refer to as AV2, the South Sulawesi languages systematically do two things. They show special morphology in little v. So we see a morphological change within the verbal complex, and they show low agreement with the internal argument. I've shown this in Konjo here. The morphological signature of AV2, the morphological change that we see involves the absence of nasal substitution here. So this is an antipassive clause. Okay. This is a normal antipassive clause or agent voice clause. We see Amir ate bananas, indefinite object, and we see this prefix ang that causes nasal substitution on the stem. When we do the same thing, when we extract an external argument and the internal argument is definite, we see the same, we see a prefix ang, but crucially, there is no nasal substitution on the stem. And the internal argument triggers absolutive agreement. So we see special morphology, there's no nasal substitution, and we see special agreement with the internal argument. And I'd like to claim that this pattern provides evidence for special licensing pressure of the internal argument being met by agreement beneath T. We see the same thing in an unrelated, or well, in a subgroup of Western Malayo-Polynesian spoken not so far away, called Bunku Tolaki. So the Bunku Tolaki languages are spoken in southeastern Sulawesi. They show the same agent voice, patient voice contrast and indefiniteness effect. I'll be focusing on Tolaki to illustrate this pattern in this set of languages. So the many connoisseurs of the Irialis paradigm of Bunku Tolaki agreement, I'll ask you to forget about your much knowledge about Irialis agreement marking here. We're focusing on Realis contexts, where we see a very typical South Sulawesi-like agreement system. So in 12a, we see a normal agent voice clause in Tolaki. We have a prefix mong, this is like mang, an absolutive suffix, which indexes the absolutive argument, and then an indefinite internal argument. In the patient voice, like in South Sulawesi, we see an ergative prefix, a verb, then we see an absolutive suffix indexing the internal argument. And as in Sulawesi, we can say the absolutive agreement sits in T, and the absolutive argument moves to spec of TP. There's a licensing relationship there. Now, the Bunku Tolaki languages, like the South Sulawesi languages, do the same thing when we have a definite internal argument in an agent voice only context. We see special morphology in little v, and we see low agreement with the internal argument. So these examples are shown in 13. Just to tell you what you're seeing, the morphological signature of this AV2 construction, this different AV construction, involves the disappearance of a prefix like pang or pong, right? So in a normal agent voice clause, we have a prefix mong. So this is an extraction context that involves an indefinite object. When we have a definite object, something like the child who, or a definite internal argument, like the child who bit himself, we no longer see this mong prefix. Instead, we have infixed directly into the verbal stem and an absolutive suffix indexing the internal argument. So just like in South Sulawesi, we see a morphological change and we see special low agreement with the internal argument. And there's many reasons to believe that this agreement that appears is really in little v. And I will argue that this pattern provides evidence for low licensing by little v in this context. So just to illustrate explicitly what I am claiming, the idea is that these languages employ a special little v when the internal argument is definite and cannot be licensed by T. This little v does two things. It triggers object shift to spec little vp, and it triggers agreement with the internal argument. These properties allow the internal argument to be definite and allow it to be licensed. I schematized this in 15. We have the little v, AV2, agreeing with the internal argument, shifting it, and licensing it. And as we've seen, there's robust morphological evidence for this little v. We see the same basic pattern across South Sulawesi and Bunku Tolaki. A reflex of pang or pong goes away, and we just get something like ber in this context. And I will note non-finite clauses, non-finite complementation is exceedingly complex in these languages, but it might be reasonable to assume that non-finite contexts, at least some of them, do not allow the internal argument to interact with T. And in non-finite contexts, these languages do show the sum of the same morphology. So just a note, this is not about A-bar extraction. So what does this mean? Well, it means that there is some systematic licensing pressure in these languages that is typically not met beneath T, right? So in matrix monotransitive contexts, indefinite internal arguments have to interact with T. They have to be licensed by T. When this is impossible, something changes. They show exceptional agreement with the internal argument on little v. And what I take this to suggest is there is a licensing need within the little vp, which is typically not met. We don't normally see this low agreement because the internal argument is typically licensed by T. in this context where it can't be licensed by T, we have to do something special, right? And that's why we see this pattern. And I will note that this is not a special quirk of the languages of South Sulawesi and Bungku Tolaki. It's something that we see in a lot of places. So in the languages that show case marking, we see special case marking. And in the languages with agreement systems, we see this low absolutive agreement everywhere. So it occurs all across Sulawesi. We see it, for instance, in Uma. And we see it elsewhere in Indonesia in other languages that show agreement systems. So this is present in the Barrier Islands languages like Enggano, and Eric Zobel informs me it was also present in Old Javanese and varieties of Old Batak. So I think what all of this really suggests is that there's something special about licensing in these languages. There's a systematic pressure for the internal argument to be licensed that drives its eventual position. In normal patient voice clauses, it winds up licensed by T, and that accounts for its high position. It moves to spec TP. And when it can't be licensed by T, right, something special needs to happen. Right? That's why we see exceptional patterns of low licensing. So in other words, I take this pattern to provide evidence for a view of Philippine-type syntax that's sort of driven by the requirement of nominal licensing of the absolutive argument. And I will note that on this analysis, we can understand Philippine-type languages to be very similar to sort of high absolutive languages cross-linguistically, right? So many ergative languages, like Philippine-type languages, seem to systematically place the absolutive argument in a high position. And the literature on these languages often links this to patterns of nominal licensing because, as in Sulawesi, you can see agreement between T and this argument. So if we adopt this view, we can sort of understand Philippine-type languages as not really anything terribly unique, but as sort of just another case of high absolutive languages, especially those in Sulawesi. Thank you very much. I will conclude.
All right, thank you. We have around 8 minutes for questions. Feel free to raise your hand. Matt Pearson.
Hi, thank you for this talk. The data is really interesting and the phenomenon is not something I'd ever noticed before. My question is, it looks like in order to make the system work, there needs to be a preference for high absolutive licensing, and you kind of do low absolutive licensing only as a last resort. And I wonder how do we capture the last resort nature of low absolutive licensing? How do we prevent low absolutive licensing from overgeneralizing?
Right, that's an extremely good question. Before anything else, I would like to note we might want low absolutive syntax to overgeneralize because the historical path of losing definiteness effects in agent voice does involve generalizing the low absolutive configuration from extracting the external argument, agent voice, and definite internal argument being okay to just regular agent voice, definite internal argument is okay. Like this is what's argued to have underlied the loss of the definiteness effect in languages of Western Indonesia. So we do on some level want it to be possible to lose this. Now, as to what actually constrains the distribution of low absolutive licensing, there's been a lot of work on Mayan which tries to link this to selectional properties of particular little v's, and this implicates a theory of A-bar features and all of that. I think this line of work is not terribly. There may be better ways to do this because we see the same low licensing in control contexts, with non-finite clauses that might lack A-bar movement. So I think that beyond stipulating that this just is a last resort, what one might want to say is something like, well, there's sort of like, there may be just like, if you have agreement on T anyway, like, don't do agreement, don't have multiple instances of agreement along the causal spine, right? Like we're always seeing agreement in T. And so if you're doing that anyway, like there's no reason to have agreement lower. I mean, it does have a sort of uncomfortable global economy like flavor to it, but I think this is inherent in all sorts of, in discussion of all types of last resort phenomena. So I agree, this is a problem that requires a solution, but it may not be the worst one.
Thanks.
All right, Dan.
Thanks for this really interesting talk. I had three questions. I don't expect you to answer them all, but just I'll spit them out. First of all, like languages like Mamuju, where the low absolutive can end up high and the absolutive clitic can end up cliticizing to an interrogative. Is that a deep difference, or is that just something trivial? Secondly, how do you account for the actual case that appears on the low absolutive? So in the languages you're looking at, it really is absolutive, but in other languages it's genitive, and in Philippine languages it's oblique, and it can't be a clitic at all. And thirdly, I think it was 11b, you talk about this form that I think I also talked about last year in this Apple talk, where you have what looks like maybe an antipassive prefix, but no nasal substitution. And I think I suggested there that it maybe is one of two things. It's like either an antipassive with some kind of barrier between the stem, or maybe that ang is really just a remnant of a complementizer, and what you're getting is a patient voice verb without agreement. Both of those seem kind of plausible to me, but I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Thank you for these questions. Let me address them in inverse order. The last question concerns the status of the prefix ang in Konjo, which does not trigger nasal substitution. So Ulo Sirk, in 1989, in an issue of Nusa, argued convincingly that this is a reflex of It is an externalized prefix reflex of and not yang. Right. So the etymology of that prefix is actually known, and we can talk more. I don't want to drown everyone in the morphophonemics of South Sulawesi languages, but I'm willing to do that in a later session. With regard to the first question, so what Dan observes is that in the South Sulawesi languages, that low absolutive agreement is right adjacent to the verb in the set of contexts that I've identified. We can see that it doesn't surface in second position in many of these languages. Nevertheless, there are two languages spoken on the northwestern fringe of this area where this absolutive clitic does surface in second position. So in most of the South Sulawesi languages, the low agreement is literally verb adjacent. In two languages on the periphery, it really moves, like it is able to surface much higher up. Now, I agree that this is an interesting pattern. It exists not only in Mamuju, but Ulumanda as well. But I think this is actually not revealing at all with, as to the actual structural position of the clitic for the following reason. The absolutive enclitic in the South Sulawesi languages is not something that is really convincingly positioned in the syntax. It does things like split islands, it intercedes between coordinate structures. And I've argued in the past that the mechanisms which govern its placement are really not syntactic in nature. And so the fact that a thing that is linearized in the phonology can exceptionally surface sort of farther to the left, I think tells us nothing about syntax. I think it's a fact about phonology and the phonology of that clitic in two languages on the periphery. So I think, let me summarize my responses. To 3, the question of what the prefix is in Konjo, Ulo Sirk showed in 89 that it is a reflex of To the question of what happens with clitics that surface farther to the left, it's phonology. With regard to question 2, how do I account for the special case that appears in Philippine-type languages and, for instance, Arayal? Well, this is a theory of the languages of Sulawesi. It's a convenient fact that in Arayal we do see low absolutive case marking, right? But Tagalog is not Arayal, and Tagalog is also not a language of Sulawesi. So in Tagalog, pronouns take sa, the dative marker, but other definite things just take the normal, like, oblique case marker, right? And so someone who wants to port this theory to Tagalog would have to say, well, okay, there's shift, and maybe there's multiple strategies of licensing, but it's really not what's at issue for a proposal over the languages of, South Sulawesi and Bungku Tolaki. Thank you for the questions.
Okay, there's 1 minute left if anyone has a real quick question. Oh, Dan, you want to add anything in addition?
Richard, you have a question?
Can I just throw out? So, I mean, it generally, so thank you, this is great. Generally in all of this kind of discussion where we're talking about licensing definites, in future work, I would love to know specifically what exactly are the kind of nominals that require this form of licensing. What is the sort of semantic characterization of them, if that is a semantic thing at all, right? And yeah, I think it would be worth really trying to spell that out, because I mean, I'm generally interested in this kind of phenomenon in terms of, what the syntax of object shift or whatever, right? What exactly it is tying into in terms of the semantics, right? And whether that cutoff point, right, and specificity or whatever actually is the same thing across these different Austronesian languages or not, right? Because I think that's actually an open question. So it would be great to know more about that from Sulawesi.
Let me answer this in one line. I can't speak to any language but Mondar, but in Mondar, all the things that you would prototypically identify as definite, so both presuppositional and anaphoric definites, trigger this behavior. So if you say, out of the blue, who saw the sun, where the sun is not at all presupposed in the discourse, but everyone knows the sun exists, it's sort of a uniqueness definite, you do get this. So the factors that condition this, the appearance of low agreement in Mondar are exactly identical semantically to those which force the patient voice in a matrix context. And I think it's an overarching sort of, we can talk about this later, but yes, thank you for the question.
Thanks.
All right, please join me in thanking Dan again.